We all have the capacity in any given moment to turn up the volume of empathy in our lives. And when we do, it can be game changing.
Welcome to the Field podcast. I'm Frida Wells, and this podcast name is inspired by Rumi's words. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. Join me as we wander out beyond wrong and right, following our curiosity to explore diverse perspectives from amazing people whose work and lives inspire new insights that can enrich and support our own journey in this world, giving us access to wisdom and new narratives that nurture our collective potential. And please join me as we wander out into the field. Today's guest is Dr. Anita Nowak, discussing her book, Purposeful Empathy, Tapping Our Hidden Superpower for Personal, Organisational and Social Change. I absolutely loved this wisdom-filled conversation where Anita guides us through the neuroscience and evidence showing that empathy is, far from a weakness, actually a superpower that builds social capital and drives better results at work. You'll learn how to listen so people feel truly heard, discover why building community is as important as self-care, and find out how small acts of curiosity can strengthen the social fabric around you. We'll explore how community building is like muscle memory, something we need to exercise proactively, not just during crises. Anita shares a simple but powerful tool for navigating difficult decisions, and learn why the key to both personal fulfillment and stronger communities might be simpler than you think. A beautiful conversation also touches on how we're not only wired for self-actualization, but for something greater, how othering is at the root of many of the world's big crises today, and how more fulfilling life awaits us beyond the pursuit of personal success. So join me as we step into the field with Dr. Anita Nowak. Dr. Anita Nowak, it is a real honour to have you on the field today. We'll try and get through as much of your beautiful wisdom as we can, and we can always see if we can get you on again. To start things off, I was going to ask if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself to listeners.
I would love to. And Frida, I just have to say from the onset that you're fairly new in the podcasting world, but I want you to picture that early day podcasts, when I would film them, I would put my laptop on an ironing board. So, you know what I mean? It looks professional sometimes, but you never know what happens behind the scenes. So we all started some, right? And I was a beginner not too long ago.
Thank you.
And I wish you well with the podcast. I'm excited for your listeners as you grow your platform. So I'm based in Montreal. I teach at McGill University. I've been teaching there for almost 15 years. The courses that I love to teach and have the privilege to teach are things like social entrepreneurship, leadership. I taught ethics and management for a while, and now I'm teaching a positive psychology class called Happiness Means Business. So I love teaching. I love being in the classroom, co-creating a space for learning and growth with my undergrads. So that's an important thing to know about me. 2 years ago, my first book came out. It's called Purposeful Empathy, Tapping Our Hidden Power for Personal, Organizational, and Social Change. I think there's never been a moment in human history that we've needed empathy more than we do now. I really believe it. The last thing I'd say about me professionally is that I'm a certified coach. My coaching practice is with high net worth individuals and families. I work with family offices and their foundations to help give away their philanthropic dollars in a way that will achieve social impact, but in a way that really respects the nonprofit sector. I spent years as a professional fundraiser myself. I understand the needs of grassroots organizations and NGOs. I really advocate on behalf of those nonprofits. So there you go. There's a little bit about me.
Thank you. And you introduced your book, so now I don't have to. But it is what catalyzed this conversation. And reflecting on what you just shared about yourself, I picture this big old Venn diagram that you are at the intersection of a lot of different spaces, and you're a really effective translator between business and NGOs, or between learning and doing, and between the personal growth space and organizational responsibility. And so I have to applaud that, because that can seem overwhelming and challenging to most of us. Where did you get this skill, Anita?
I have a mentor that is now in his 80s, and I've known him for 20 years. He has been a delightful person in my life to stress test ideas. He's an intelligent man, even though we're on the opposite sides of the political spectrum. And And he used to always say to me, Anita, you are spread too thin. You have to focus. And I said, no, my work and my passions are like pieces of a quilt and they come together in a beautiful quilt formation. And he said, no, you need a blanket. You don't need a quilt. And we have had this ongoing argument about that. It's interesting that you note that because I think my perspective on the world is informed by the fact that I actually have navigated a bunch of different sectors and spaces and conversations for what that's worth.
That's really insightful, and that you share you have a mentor, I think that speaks to kind of a humility that learning never stops, the value of finding our knowledge guardians or wise elders, to not feel like we need to know everything. And that's really inspiring. I feel like I want to go out and find a wise 80-year-old now.
It's interesting because I feel I'm paying forward what was given to me. I have memories of conversations with other mentors trying to make a big decision. And one woman so insightfully said, Anita, when you're making a tough decision, it's only tough because two of your values are held in tension. And if you can identify what those two values are, then you can begin to consider in this moment which value you want to uplift, even if both are important to you. And that framing was so wise. I've now had students or alum come to seek out advice from me about a big decision they're making. I'll use that frame for them, and it always opens up aha moments. So I think mentorship matters, and my students mentor me. Yes, we can always learn some more.
I feel like we could stop right there. That was old. I think it's beautiful also that you credit where credit's due, like the mentors that have passed these things on to you. And it makes me picture the quilt of wisdom spreading between each of us as we get to these junctures in our lives with tricky decisions. That's really inspiring. And perhaps a good pivot, talking about someone else's wisdom or insight giving us an aha moment. That's really that inner space dimension of our world and our life. Maybe that's a good time to come to the quality of empathy, which you've written an entire book about. And I noticed at the start of your book, you've got a long list of beautiful testimonials from people who are high up in the world of business, in the world of empathy, academics. I love this review from Derek Sievers. Reading Purposeful Empathy is like attending a wellness retreat and leadership masterclass at the same time. Do yourself a favor and read it.
Derek Silvers lives in your country right now.
He does. There you go. There's a connection right there. To pivot to empathy, I could start with this wonderful question. Your book's subtitle frames empathy as a hidden superpower, and that's a really big claim. So what makes you think so?
Okay, let's start with a juicy story that I've told before, but actually invites a sense of resonance from anybody who hears it. So, as anyone is listening to the story, there's the protagonist, me, and the other person in the story. I believe that everyone listening will relate to both sides of the equation. So I claim that empathy is our superpower because I lived a moment while I was studying empathy for my PhD. I felt what empathy can bring to a conversation or a relationship from a visceral standpoint. Like it wasn't at a cognitive level, it's that I lived something interesting. So I want you to picture 15 years ago, before we all had cell phones to distract, what it felt like to stand in a long line waiting to buy something. In my case, I was standing in a long line to send a package during the holiday season. And it took a half hour for me to get up to the counter. And when I finally did, I remember feeling bored, probably hungry, probably tired, like just get me out of here. I want to send the package and let's just do this as fast as possible. And the woman who greeted me was so sharp and so rude that I remember having this reaction of, what's wrong with you? How could you talk to me like that? And let me call you out on it and maybe even one up you. Yeah, you want to take it there? Let me take it there. It was in a flash. I think we can all relate to that sensory feeling of how dare you? And because I had been studying the neuroscience of empathy around that time and been exposed to the idea of neuroplasticity and that our brains are plastic, we can change the neural connections in our brain if we wanted to. I was doing all sorts of experiments about practicing empathy in a variety of different contexts. And here was a moment. And it was a flash. It was like, okay, go for it. Practice some empathy. And so I looked at the woman square eye to eye and I just asked the simple question, "Are you okay?" And there
Mm.
was a moment where I could tell she was evaluating, was I being sarcastic or passive aggressive? And she
Mm.
knew I was actually asking sincerely, "Are you okay?" And she burst into tears. And she said to me, "I have been working double shifts for 2 weeks straight. My son is at home with fever. I'm getting sick. It's 3 in the afternoon. I haven't had a lunch break. I'm just so exhausted."
Oh.
And 10 seconds earlier, I didn't like the woman. Then all of a sudden, I found myself reaching across the counter. We were holding hands, both of us, tears streaming down our cheeks. And that moment, I understood in my body that we all have the capacity in any given moment to turn up the volume of empathy in our lives. And when we
Mm.
do, it can be game changing.
Mm.
And not only did I give her space to shed a few tears and shake off some stress that she might have been feeling, but we just got to chatting. I remember getting her a mint tea. She sent the package off with grace and efficiency, and I'll never forget this woman and the lesson.
Mm.
So that's why I think it is our superpower. It's available to all of us if we decide to lean into it.
Oh, there's so much there. And I'm sure she never forgot you. You made me think of that beautiful saying, be the reason people believe in kindness in the world. You're that reason for her. And probably you resourced her to go out and be more empathetic to others. I also had that thought while you were sharing that story, which, brought a tear to my eye. It's about seeing into and reaching into someone else's world. We're so caught up in our own world that we take their mindless accident or their stress, we take it personally. And often it's just anything but. I'm wondering where we could spin off from there, because I imagine you sort of went home and you churned out a bunch of chapters for your PhD.
I mean, staying with this story for just a second, I later
Mm.
learned about the neuroscience of empathy is that our brains cannot extend empathy when we're in a state of anxiety or overwhelm ourselves.
Right.
And I think the first step, if we want to access empathy, if we're wandering around the world, and today, let's face it, we're all experiencing chronic stress all the time. It is a generalized anxiety, whether it's geopolitics or inflation or post COVID or anything. Worried about how can we be expected to be more empathic in the world when the world makes it so difficult and it's really impossible to our brains. One of the things that I've learned from neuroscience is that we first have to be aware that we are feeling burdened, overwhelmed, or anxious. Because then, if we are aware somatically that our amygdala is firing, or that we're in fight or flight, or that we've been triggered emotionally, then we can make the decision, what can I do to bring down my stress for a moment?
Mm.
Breathing. There's a bunch of different ways we can flip the switch to engage our parasympathetic nervous system. And then when we're feeling that shift of gears, what becomes possible to our brains is the opening or on ramp to empathy. And I think that's a really important thing that we need to learn about how our brains function.
That's fascinating. And I love that neuroscience in some ways gives us hope, right? Neuroplasticity is hopeful that with intention, with noticing, with practice, we can build that inner awareness. A word that I've been meditating on recently is just the word notice. That first key step, just notice what's going on. Where's my attention? What thoughts am I having? It feels like that's necessary before anything else. I also love that because you had that inner capacity, you noticed in that moment across from this woman in the post shop what was going on, that you were able to dig a little deeper. I suppose that fact about if we're stressed and anxious, we struggle with empathy. I have read we become quite self-centered, and not in this intentionally selfish way, but our amygdala, our limbic system, they're designed just to keep us alive and be self-protective and look out for our survival. So I think the spreading of practices to do with parasympathetic toning the vagal nerve has a lot of power in the world. There's so many great questions I want to get you to touch on. Extending it out to that challenging intersection of where this beautiful quality of empathy enters the business world. And so you argue that empathetic leadership has become a non-negotiable. I just wonder why and how people can become more empathetic leaders, and what are the common objections you maybe notice from leaders about that and how you overcome those or meet them?
Okay, so close to 9 years ago, I started a practice on a whim where I would
Mm.
just post a daily empathy post onto my Facebook
Mm.
page. I've been doing that for 3,400 consecutive days. There seems to be more and more of an appetite for empathy, which is great. The real changeover moment happened, no surprise, during COVID, where all of a sudden I could do a Google search and the most unlikely publications like Fortune, all these businessy type publications were paying attention to empathic leadership and empathic culture because
Mm.
they were noticing how important it was given the pandemic. And in the
Mm.
meantime, 5 years out, we're seeing almost a pendulum swing back to like everybody back at the office and,
Mm.
we got to get down to business. We're serious now enough research that has shown how much empathy in the workplace has a positive impact on the bottom line of business. 7 out of 10 employees believe that empathy matters to their business's bottom line, but only 2 out of 5 believe that it's rewarded in the workplace. 8 out of 10 CEOs also believe that it matters to their bottom line, but close to 9 out of 10 think, I don't want to show it in the workplace because if I do, I'll be less respected. These big deltas, like, okay, so I'll make the business case for a second. Even though we
Mm.
know empathic cultures lead to higher levels of engagement, lower presenteeism and absenteeism, lower stress and burnout, higher rates of better communication, loyalty, customer satisfaction. Like just the metrics are so convincing. Empathy correlates to business outcomes. I'm often stunned by, there's still the question or pushback from leaders. We are a high performance culture. Empathy sounds great, but it's going to get in the way of our success. And I'm like, no, you were talking about the amygdala earlier in our limbic
Mm.
system. Like it's the first part of our brain that grew in the womb, first
Mm.
part of us as a species. But eventually, our brains also develop in the womb and out in the world. Like we've developed our neocortex, which gives us capacity to think through things so that we're not just reacting to stimulus. We're actually being reflective and thoughtful and hopefully empathic. So, if you've got a workplace where empathy is not present, typically what fills that void is hierarchy that's based on performance, that's fear based. There's competition. There's a sense that you're not safe, you don't belong. And how do people make good decisions when they're always protecting themselves? Whereas if you've got a workplace where it's infused with authenticity, a sense of belonging, there's more widespread empathy across the leadership, people are willing to be vulnerable because we're all humans. Guess what happens to the social capital in that organization? People trust each other. So, you get an email and you respond to it, and you don't have a lot of time to respond. So, you're really quick just because you want to send the email out. In the absence of social capital, somebody might read your email and falsely come to an assumption that you're being flippant, sarcastic, rude, whatever. But if you've got a social capital, you'll assume the best of somebody and you say, okay, I got a quick response, but I know them. I know they're a good person because I've spent time building up the social capital, and let me respond and assume the best of that person. That's what can actually deliver better results.
I'm convinced, thinking of my own personal experience in some workplaces, I sometimes notice a divide between really lovely CEOs who are really warm and empathetic, but then the middle management layer, perhaps it gets a bit lost. I think that's just incredibly compelling. Brain science, you can't argue with it. I learned recently trust and belonging are really preconditions for success in the workplace, and it's all about accessing that neocortex. So I think that's a powerful message. Maybe pivoting to purpose, I really gelled with that chapter in your book. It had some beautiful messages, and it's something that can kind of bridge that personal growth and organizational social conscience realm in people's lives. I wonder if you could talk about trends like quiet quitting and bare minimum Mondays. You sort of argue that empathetic organizations have an edge on the war for talent. Why is that?
Well, I think this has to be caveated that I'm describing folks that have the benefit of some degree of privilege where they
Mm.
can move to another organization or be reflective about what they want to do with their careers and their lives. So,
Mm.
with that as a caveat, I think the pandemic did, at least in the early stages, remind us of what matters in life and what our values are and how we can spend an entire career working, but at the end of the day, if we want to feel like we've lived a meaningful life to contribute in a meaningful way, aligned with our values, aligned with our sense of purpose. And so I think a lot of people figured out like, oh, you know what? I don't want to just spend 40, 50 plus hours a week helping an organization sell more XYZ to people who don't necessarily need X, Y, or Z, the way our culture has been designed. And to reflect on how do I want my skills, talents, and life to be an expression of my values so that I feel deep satisfaction for what I contributed to the world. And this aligns really well with Maslow, right? So I know we're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Once your baseline needs, we go for higher order needs. He initially described the pinnacle of human development as self-actualization, fulfilling our human potential. And I wish that for you. I wish that for your listeners. I wish that for everybody on the planet. But just before he died, he was writing about how his own model was limited and not actually accurate in terms of human nature and what we can achieve. And he said, or he wrote rather, that what we really profoundly want out of our lives is self-transcendence. You know, once we've achieved, what do we want to do? But we naturally want to give back. And it's part of our core human nature to be of service to others and be of service to something greater than ourselves. I think the quiet quitting and those trends are small hints at the overarching comment that we're not meant to be cogs in a wheel. Our lives are much bigger than that. What we have in terms of our capacity for transcending the uniqueness of our lives and being part of a bigger movement towards, let's say, more peace in the world or more justice in the world or sustainability in the world calls to us. That's why we're unsatisfied with just participating in systems that are dead ends to human flourishing.
Thank you. I appreciate the caveat at the start. I think that's important to acknowledge. And I love that you went to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That was my next question for you, because I loved that story about what he didn't quite get to publish before the end of his life, that actually he'd sort of superseded self-actualization to self-transcendence. I think for me, that reminds me of the story of Darwin, that his work was so misinterpreted. Survival of the fittest wasn't about the fittest individual. It was the fittest societies were cooperative. Thank you. Another beautiful response with so much wisdom. I'm going to be replaying that. It also opened up that big aspect of our lives of, you know, why we hear that social responsibility or social change thing. When you talk about it, calls to us to do something for others. I'm curious to get a bit nerdy for a second and to dissect what even do we mean when we say something calls to us? Is there something nearly somatic? Is it that invitation to tap into our body's intelligence that our modern world has maybe cut us off from a little?
So I'm in the early stages of reading a book called The Tao of Complexity by Dr. Jean Holt out of the UK. So I met her because I care deeply about the inner development goals, as do you. We both IDG Hub coordinators, and I decided to spend an entire season doing a deep dive with experts on each of those 23 skills. So one of the skills is called complexity awareness, and I discovered work and hadn't read her book at the time of the interview, but absolutely fell into a huge girl crush with her. And I'm happy that if you share the link to the conversation with your listeners, I would appreciate it, because she's got a master's and a PhD in physics from Cambridge and Oxford, respectively. So she's a scientist. She talks about how most science, even today, refers to closed systems. And how you can predict behavior based on cause and effect. And she says, but nothing about the way humans live their lives is a closed system. We behave in ways that are just very hard to predict and behavioral economic figure out. But she's basically saying complexity requires an understanding of our interdependence and tapping into things like intuition. A woman who's superbly well-educated, incredibly scientist and physicist, talking about something like intuition.
Yeah.
And so having conversations with people like her,
Mm.
where we are in the early stages of letting go of paradigms based on the Enlightenment thinking of rationalism and using our brains as the only mechanism to make decisions and inform how we feel about things, of entering a new era where we recognize that we have full bodies telling us in real time and giving us clues about how to make decisions and leaning into the future as it's emerging, which is an Otto Scharmer Theory U concept. So
Mm.
that is opening doors for me to say, what is our calling? The mystics and sages have been saying it forever. Our calling
Yeah.
is to live all the gifts that we've been bestowed, to heal all the hurts, whether they are through our younger years or through the intergenerations that we've experienced pains and traumas, so that we can take all the gifts that we were endowed with and co-create something better for everyone.
Mm.
So the calling is the entire spectrum of what humanity is capable of. And we just have to figure out for ourselves, what do I feel called to do that will make me feel alive? And again, I get the fact that that sounds like a privileged statement,
Mm.
because everybody has access to, making those decisions because they don't have food on the table or shelter. So I'll go back to that early caveat. But in the situation where we have choices, I think we're denying our living ecosystem, ourselves, the opportunity to truly flourish if we're
Mm.
just busy following the social norms and the systems that, again, really are toxic to our flourishing.
That's beautiful wisdom there. I love the way you described it. I won't remember it perfectly, but we're at the early stages of acknowledging that maybe that rational idea that our brain's the only mechanism that can tell us what to do is maybe limited. I agree with you and find all this science hopeful because you do look out in the world and see things that feel so broken, and it can be easy to feel hopeless about that. But in some ways, the science is showing that there are ebbs and flows in humanity, and in some ways, the poison is the medicine. When we see things, it's like trust our gut reaction about that. If it doesn't feel good and right, there's something deeper we're being called to look at, to do differently, and to keep naming it to each other, I think, counts for something. That's a lovely entry point to another question, and maybe that was already your answer, because I did want to ask you, I mean, you're a published author of a stunning book, which I can't wait to promote for you, Purposeful Empathy. And I wanted to ask sort of where you get your inspiration. Like you've mentioned The Tao of Complexity. What a wonderful title. What other books are bringing you inspiration right now that you'd like to uplift?
Oh, there's a book that I finished reading not too long ago,
Mm.
by the founder of Acumen, the Acumen Fund and Patient Capitalism. She's done a couple of TED Talks. Her name is Jacqueline Novogratz, and she
Mm.
wrote the Manifesto for a Moral Revolution, and that was just an extraordinary book.
Oh, wow.
Her own book before that, called Blue Sweater, is also 10 years ago, but it's an amazing account of her own personal journey. But this one, The Manifesto for a Moral Revolution, is making the case for social entrepreneurs, the people that are trying to solve social and environmental problems and scale those solutions are heroes. But I don't want to fall into hero worship, because it's not
Mm-hmm.
just about sole entrepreneur that's the founder of these nonprofits. It's all the people across the entire organization, but then also the stakeholders across the entire system that make change possible. So that was an amazing book. I'm reading a book right
Mm.
now called Spared, by a woman who's a
Mm.
Rwandan genocide survivor.
Ugh.
And April is the month, the onset of the Rwandan genocide, where 31 years ago, close to 1 million people were killed in 100 days.
Wow.
I mean, it's so tragic and so hard to digest that communities and neighbors could have turned on each other. So much of her story is a reminder of how quickly violence can erupt
Mm.
if the flames are fanned of othering. That was a really important book to read recently, not only because othering, we want to be allergic to othering. I think politicians, especially on the right, do a really good job of helping us other others.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And we have to be really, really cautious about when we scapegoat other people for what's going wrong with society.
Mm.
It was a takeaway for that reason, but also her own narrative and conviction around perseverance and faith and the miracles that happen in life. She survives, obviously, and goes on to the United States and is now a PhD in education and an extraordinary
Oh
woman.
gosh.
But she spent some time in a refugee camp, and there was this one little story that has stayed with me where there was a 3-year-old girl in the camp who was orphaned and wandering around without her family and clueless about what was going on. The
Mm.
author had a soap and would wash the one dress that girl was wearing on a regular basis just to give her the
Mm.
dignity of clean to play in. And when she asked somebody who was running in and out of the camp and doing errands and getting messages in and out, she asked if she could give a sweater to help her stay warm at night. She just needed a sweater. And the message
Mm.
came back, a girl that had privilege and had access to many sweaters in her closet, saying, "Everybody's going through a hard time. I'm sorry, I can't help you."
Oof.
The parallel between, people who have
Mm.
nothing to give and people who have lots are not willing to give. We just have to really look at ourselves in the mirror and say,
Mm.
who are we? How do we want to express ourselves in all these moments when people are suffering? It's really important that we lean into empathy, generosity, compassion, and kindness. It's not just sort of soft ha ha la la la. It's this is the meat and bones of what it means to be alive as a human being, to engage in
Mm.
those ways.
Mm. I just got lulled into, like, I was being read a bedtime story. I can see how you're a university lecturer. You're just a wonderful storyteller. And thank you for the book recommendations, The Manifesto of Moral Revolution. I'll put those links in the show notes. And Spared, I mean, I think I remember from reading about you on your website that you started out life, you did go and do volunteer work in, was it Rwanda or no?
Yeah, yeah, it was in
Right.
Rwanda.
Yeah, there's so many emotions in the story you just told, right? I mean, there's heartbreak, and you don't have to look far in the world right now to see the parallel with Gaza, which I didn't think I'd see in my lifetime. I remember being 15, studying social sciences, the formation of the UN, and characters like Hannah Arendt, who is a hero of mine, and just believing that the fact that this knowledge now existed, that we had it, meant we would learn the lessons from it. I suppose in the story you just told, there's the heartbreak of what humans can do to each other. And there's maybe a nice angle we can take into our present day lives, when we are feeling overwhelmed by a lot of negativity out there, a lot of challenge and things that feel like they're not working. There's something about connecting with our personal agency. There's always something we can do to build that social fabric between us, build that kindness, her washing of the dress. And I also really deeply agree with what you just said about the privilege that people don't even realize they have. Would it hurt to have given that sweater?
I want to add to this comment about
Mm.
personal agency, what we can all do to, I say, turn up the volume of empathy in our lives, but it's just, practice a little more empathy, say, how are you a little bit more often, all of those ways that we can individually act. But lately, what's really capturing my attention, I mean, I'm based in Canada, and I don't know if the news has made it all the way out to New Zealand. I imagine it has, but the
Mm.
US is on record saying multiple times, not in a joking manner, that Canada wouldn't it be great if it could become the 51st state?
Yeah.
We have a Canadian election happening.
Mm.
The Canadians are taking that threat very seriously and now are looking at Ukraine in an entirely different manner.
Yeah.
So, in thinking out long term, a worst case scenario, even if it's not a military takeover, just the tariffs on Canada, it's going to decimate our economy and move into a recession. And this was completely unprovoked and unnecessary. And at the same time,
Yeah.
Americans will suffer likewise. I think to myself,
Mm.
how would we brace ourselves for that? And it's easy to be alarmist and fall into fear. You may want to get up and protest. I have done that. And I believe everybody has a place, whether you're an artist, a poet, everybody has something to contribute
Mm.
to fight back against territorial gain, authoritarianism, fascism, whatever you want to call it.
Mm.
I believe more and more now, and I'm, building on the voices of those who came before me who have said the same thing. For me, it's finally also a visceral thing. If we don't lean into community, that's
Mm.
where it becomes hard. in the West, we didn't have war. We more or less had good social safety nets in Canada, whether it's mat paternity leave, healthcare, resources. We've had good governance. We haven't been up against a massive crisis with the exception of COVID. But even COVID, the tail end of it was political and ideological divides. We were increasingly divided. I think just like when you go to the gym and you gain muscle memory and you'll work up muscle and then a month will pass, you don't work out, you'll lose your strength. When you go back to the gym, your muscle remembers and you grow that muscle back, muscle memory. I feel the same way towards community, that if we do not exercise our communityship now proactively, we'll have to rely on community during a crisis, but why not do that with intentionality beforehand so that we can transcend whatever crisis comes our way and feel emboldened as citizens of democracies to say, no, we will resist this. And so I think that's becoming like agency for one, and what can we do at an individual level, but also what can we do as a community and how much we need community and how we've always needed community to thrive as a species.
Anita, that was such a beautiful answer. Thank you. I know you had to go now anyway, but we couldn't have ended on a more beautiful message. Communityship. Heard it here. I've never heard it before. And it nearly feels like a responsible self-care. You know, we exercise, we meditate, we eat our veg for the quality of our life. And that feels like the equivalent on the collective level. And the good news is it feels good to connect. I think that message is needed in New Zealand right now. Definitely. We have had all that news and it's sort of shocking and hilarious at the same time because it's so like, am I actually hearing this right? And I know that Canada, certainly for me, and I've read this in really adorable books about Canada, that you're just known for being kind. Like it's just the nation of beautiful manners. Michael Moore famously was walking around your streets and asking people, why is your door not locked? COVID had a similar kind of polarizing effect in New Zealand. And I think there's an invitation there for us to have compassion if we're feeling that otheredness or that closed offness, like maybe the other person's really just in a amygdala hijack sort of mindset and choosing how we show up. Is that the last note you're happy to end on before we sign off?
Yeah, picking up on just that last thread, I guess I would say our brains are designed when we listen to respond, not to understand. And so if we're always listening to respond and we do not give more space for listening to understand, we will misunderstand each other. We have so much more in common than what divides us. If we were prepared to do a little bit more listening
parties. Anita, thank you so much. You've made my day. I mean, this has been a really beautiful conversation with so much wisdom that I think is going to stick in people's minds and hearts and maybe help us all show up with a bit more empathy. I will encourage people to look out for Anita's book, Purposeful Empathy. I'll include all the links in the show notes and they can find you and also your beautiful podcast, the Purposeful Empathy podcast. Just a huge thank you. I have a huge girl crush on you with your work.
So sweet of you to say. I'll just end with you. I have a weekly podcast. I have a weekly newsletter on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram, Facebook. You get a daily empathy post. So if you're looking for a little lift, I hope you'll connect. Thank you so much for this invitation. It was great to spend this hour with you.
Thank you. I love that you never quite know where the conversation is going to go, but it's been such a beautiful one. Thank you for doing the good work. Wish you a beautiful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on The Field podcast. I'm Frida Wells, and that was the wonderful Dr. Anita Nowak. Feel free to share this recording with your friends and hit subscribe. See you next time out in the field.